My monstrous mother-in-law kicked us out onto the street without a penny of money. Now we have to spend the night with friends. My name is Jake, and my wife's name is Susan. We met in college during our final year and immediately realized that we were made for each other. Our relationship progressed swiftly, and within a year, we decided to move in together. That's when the problems with Susan's mom, Karen, began. When I came to pick up Susan's things to move them to our new apartment, Karen greeted me with poorly concealed displeasure. She eyed me up and down with a critical gaze, her expression showing clear disapproval. From the moment I arrived, Karen started questioning me about my job, salary, and future plan. I tried to respond calmly and kindly, but after each answer, she just shook her head with a look that said, "I thought so." Susan tried to defend me, but her mother sharply cut her off. As we loaded the car with our things, we were saying goodbye when Karen suddenly declared, "Susan, you're making a terrible mistake. This loser isn't worth it, he'll be a burden on you for the rest of your life." I wanted to object, but Susan abruptly cut me off and dragged me to the exit. In the car, she burst into tears and couldn't calm down for a long time. That was just the first episode in a long history of difficult relations with my mother-in-law. Since then, Karen never missed a chance to express her grievances and dissatisfaction with me every time we met. Our encounters always ended in arguments and mutual resentment. I tried to maintain composure and behave decently, but her cutting remarks only dug deeper into my hurt and anger. Susan also tried to mend the relationship, but her mother ignored all her efforts. The situation became intolerable. Relations with Susan's mother poisoned the atmosphere in our family. We had to choose, either sever all ties with her mother or urgently seek paths to reconciliation. I leaned more towards the first option, but Susan was categorically against severing ties with her only close relative. The situation was further complicated by the fact that, after college, Susan and I were too young and inexperienced to afford separate housing. We were strapped for cash, and no one would approve us for a mortgage, so we had to temporarily move into Karen's apartment. We hoped that in a couple of years, once our careers were established, we could buy our own place, but Karen was in no hurry to let us go. She claimed that it's better for young people to live with their parents, gain experience, and save money. At the same time, Karen constantly emphasized that I was a worthless failure, unable to provide Susan with a decent standard of living. Fierce arguments erupted between us over trivial matters. Karen always portrayed me as incompetent, incapable of basic tasks. She nitpicked about how I loaded the dishwasher, ironed shirts, or made the bed. Occasionally, she meddled in mine and Susan's personal relationship, teaching her how to manage the household and raise a husband properly. Susan tried to smooth over the conflicts, but she often found herself caught in the middle. Sometimes she sided with me, sometimes she sided with her mother, adding to the tension. Karen reminded us at every opportunity that this was her home, and we were just temporary tenants. She snidely inquired when we would finally start renting our own place or at least pay for utilities. Karen had plenty of reasons to start a scandal. She could throw a fit because I hung towels in the bathroom incorrectly or left a dirty cup on the table. Once we almost fought because, in her opinion, I watched TV for too long and bothered others. Another time she accused me of being careless when I forgot to turn off the kitchen light. Karen nitpicked about everything: how I arranged things in the closet, cleaned my shoes, or hung laundry to dry. Every mistake I made she presented as evidence of my worthlessness and inability to support a family. The climax was a scandal over washing the dishes not to her liking. Karen seized a fork, which, according to her, wasn't clean enough, waving it in my face, shrieking, and calling me names. I couldn't take it and snatched the fork from her hand. In response, Karen slapped me across the face with her open palm. A brawl ensued during which we broke a dozen plates. Susan tried to calm us down, but in vain. In the midst of the argument, loud knocks on the door interrupted us. It was two neighbors, summoned by the noise. They barely managed to separate us, threatening to call the police. After that incident, it seemed like something shifted in Karen's head. She stopped having constant tantrums but instead turned her disdain and contempt towards me. She met every word of mine with a spiteful smirk, clearly demonstrating that she considered me an absolute nobody. Sometimes I caught her piercing, hateful gaze, which made me uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the neighbors, after that scandal, tried to avoid both me and Karen, actively avoiding even eye contact. The awkward situation poisoned our lives. with each passing day, I suspected more and more that Karen was deliberately trying to turn Susan against me. Her biting remarks towards me poured out endlessly. She mocked and belittled me at every convenient opportunity. Susan found herself in a difficult situation. She loved us both and didn't want to break off relations with either me or her mother. She tried not to interfere in the disputes between me and Karen, but when the arguments became too intense, she tried to calm us down. Sometimes she sided with me, sometimes she defended her mother, which put her in a tough spot. I saw how painfully Susan was going through this situation. She loved, but her mother was also very dear to her. Karen, it seemed, decided to take advantage of this, trying to completely turn her daughter against me. Sometimes it seemed to me that Karen's efforts were bearing fruit. Susan became colder and more distant. I felt that she was doing everything in her power to push me away from Susan, belittling me in her eyes. Susan also noticed this change in her mother, and I saw how hard it was for her to decide whose side to take. Sometimes she supported my attempts to somehow smooth things over with Karen, but there were periods when she clearly avoided me and listened to her mother's admonitions. At some point, Susan and I realized that if we continued to stay at home, we could easily go crazy from the constant tense atmosphere and Karen's nitpicking. We started spending all our free time on trips to parks, walks around the city, visits to museums, and other public places on weekends. We would spend the whole day in the woods or at the nearest beach. Susan enjoyed the opportunity to spend time away from her constantly grumbling mother, and I was glad to briefly escape from Karen's constant scrutiny and biting remarks. While we were enjoying the fresh air outdoors, Karen spent time alone at home watching TV series or knitting. At her age, she didn't feel like moving around too much. She preferred to sit on the couch, and although Karen occasionally called us to ask when we would return, overall she was satisfied that she could be alone and no one disturbed her doing what she loved. For us, these joint walks and trips became a real breath of fresh air. At such moments, we could briefly forget about all the problems and simply enjoy each other's company. In nature, we made plans for the future, discussing ways to earn enough money to finally move out of Karen's place and get our own place. It was starting to seem to us that nothing was impossible. Coming home, we felt rested and at peace for a while. But as soon as Karen opened her mouth, everything fell back into place. Her sharp remarks, mocking glances, and contemptuous attitude towards me quickly dispelled any sense of peace, and again, it became sickening to realize that we were still living under the same roof as this woman. Unable to find common ground with her, for several months, Susan and I had been dreaming of escaping the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment for a while and relaxing somewhere far from Karen. In the evenings, we researched possible options, and in the end, we chose a small coastal town, Cape May, in New Jersey. It wasn't that far away, just a few hours' drive from our city. Cape May attracted us with its picturesque landscapes, long sandy beaches, and relatively inexpensive housing. At this time of year, we planned to rent a cozy cottage a couple of blocks from the ocean and enjoy walks along the shore every day, breathing in the healing sea air. Susan had a long-standing dream of learning to surf, and we had already found a suitable school with experienced instructor, and I dreamed of fishing right in the ocean, making up for the years spent inland. In the evenings, we planned to visit local attractions, the lighthouse, historical museum, fishing village, and the rest of the time just enjoy the peace and quiet, walks under the starry sky, and long conversations, without fearing interruptions from Karen. We already imagined ourselves returning home rested, tanned, and happy. Karen with her grumbling and complaints seemed so distant and insignificant. This week was supposed to be our first step towards an independent life away from her toxic influence. Over the course of several months, working odd jobs and helping friends, we finally saved enough money to buy bus tickets and spend a week by the ocean in a neighboring state. It was our first chance to escape from Karen's constant pressure. Albeit briefly, to avoid another scandal, we decided not to tell her about the trip, just leave for a week without warning. But on the day before departure, while Susan was doing laundry, the tickets accidentally fell out of my pocket and Karen found them in the evening. When I came home from work, Karen was waiting for us in the living room with a smug look. Susan was already there, and judging by her swollen eyes, she had been crying. So, planning to run away somewhere? Karen sneered, shaking the tickets, and didn't even bother to warn me. Am I nothing to you? I tried to explain, but my mother-in-law didn't let me get a word in. She unleashed a torrent of insults at me and forcefully crushed the tickets before throwing them in my face. Off you go then. Have fun, you selfish creatures. And I'll just languish here alone like the last old lady. In anger, Karen tore up the tickets into tiny pieces and stomped on them. Susan burst into tears. Seeing all our plans fall apart, I was stunned and furious, speechless at the turn of events. That was the final straw, overflowing the cup of my patience. Her venomous behavior had poisoned our lives for too long, Susan cried, and I was overwhelmed with anger. Enough, I said resolutely, looking directly into Karen's stunned eyes. I will no longer tolerate your humiliations and insults. If you hate me so much, then we'll just leave, right now. Karen smirked at first, but realizing I was serious, she fell silent all of a sudden. Susan, too, stood there with wide eyes, astonished. What do you mean? Karen asked with a hoarse voice. Where will you go with no money in your pockets? We'll rent a room. A basement, anything, just not to live under the same roof as you. I snapped. We'll save on food, eat grains and pasta. I'm willing to take any odd job, even scrub floors, just to avoid feeling your daily contempt. Son, think again. Karen pleaded, calling me son for the first time. Where will you go? To the streets. Stay. I won't. But I only shook my head, indicating that I had made a final decision. Unexpectedly, Susan spoke up. Enough, Mom. I love you, but this can't go on like this anymore. Your treatment of Jake crosses all boundaries. If you can't accept him as a member of the family, then it's better for us to move out separately. Karen slumped and sank into the armchair, covering her face with her hands, and I hugged Susan, grateful that she had finally sided with me in this difficult confrontation. We began to discuss the details of our departure. Renting separate accommodation was currently beyond our means, our savings had gone towards those ill-fated tickets, and our incomes were too modest. Then Susan remembered that our old friends, Mike and Jenny, had recently moved into a new apartment. They had a spare room, and they had offered us to stay with them if we ever decided to separate from Karen. Moreover, these were the same friends who lent us money for the vacation. We called them, and Mike and Jenny warmly invited us over. Gathering our modest belongings, we set off for our new temporary home that same evening. Karen begged us to reconsider, begged us to stay, but we were adamant. At Mike and Jenny's, we found shelter and a warm welcome. They understood what we had been through with Karen and did their best to support us. True, squeezing into one room with a married couple was a bit tight, but it was still better than living under the constant barrage of criticism from my mother-in-law. Unfortunately, soon I began to have problems at work. The company where I worked as a warehouse worker was going through tough times and started downsizing. Among the first to be laid off was me, as one of the last employees. It was a serious blow to our and Susan's plans to gain independence. At the same time, Susan continued to work temporarily in the college cafeteria and bring in some income. But it was clearly not enough to rent even the most modest accommodation. So I immediately started looking for a new job, willing to take on anything. We found ourselves in extremely cramped living and financial conditions, but we still had each other, and that gave us strength not to lose heart. After a couple of weeks living with Mike and Jenny, the situation began to become uncomfortable for everyone. Living with 5 people in a 2-bedroom apartment was cramped, and our friends had recently become parents, so they themselves needed personal space. One evening, while Mike and I were drinking beer in the kitchen, Karen called. Seeing her number, I initially wanted to ignore the call, but Mike nodded. Take it, he said. It turned out to be Susan calling, who had taken the phone from her mother. Her voice sounded subdued. She missed home, her things, and the familiar routine of life. Susan admitted that with each passing day, it was getting harder for her to be apart from Karen, despite all the arguments. Apparently, the long-standing bond between mother and daughter was taking its toll. This call made me look at the situation in a new light. In a fit of anger over Karen's behavior, I had dragged Susan along without thinking about the cost to her. While I was exhausted from constant clashes with my mother-in-law, Susan was clearly struggling with the idea of severing ties with her completely. Moreover, over these days, I had noticeably cooled down and distanced myself from my initial outrage. The bitter taste still lingered, but I was now looking at the situation more rational, and I realized that our temporary refuge with friends wouldn't last long. It was becoming increasingly difficult for Mike and Jenny to support extra mouths to feed. Therefore, after weighing all the pros and cons with Susan, we decided to take a new approach. Instead of permanently moving out from Karen, we would temporarily return to her. But with one important condition: I would no longer tolerate any humiliation or rudeness directed towards me. At the first signs of toxicity from my mother-in-law, we would leave again, but this time for good. Returning to Karen, I made a vow to myself to endure her antics only temporarily. It was urgent to find a job, save money, and move out at the earliest opportunity. This time, for good and for good, finding a new job was tough, everywhere they required experience or qualifications that I didn't have. But after a couple of weeks of calling probably 100 places, I finally got lucky. The owner of a small grocery store agreed to hire me as a loader and assistant. The work was hard, but I was just glad to be busy. His salary turned out to be modest, but I immediately began methodically saving every spare cent. The money was hidden in a secret niche under the floorboard in our room so Karen wouldn't suspect anything. My goal was to save enough to rent a tiny room, at least for the short term. Karen was initially wary after our return, but gradually her vigilance faded. My submissive and yielding behavior played a role, as well as Susan convincing her to let me back in. Occasionally, I still had to swallow hurtful remarks from my mother-in-law, gritting my teeth. But I stuck to my plan unwaveringly. Month after month, my secret savings grew. Susan knew about it and fully supported me. She covered most of the current expenses, allowing me to save almost all of my earnings. Hoping for a mortgage or a full-fledged apartment rental wasn't an option, but I aimed for a modest room in a family dormitory or an attic corner for a small fee. After 6 months of hard work and sacrifices, I finally saved up the necessary amount. I kept it ready, waiting for the right moment to break free from this oppressive place into my first independent life. Neither Karen or anyone else could stop us anymore. With combined efforts with Susan, we managed to scrape together enough money to pay for the first 3 months' rent of a tiny room in a family dormitory. It was our first step towards gaining independence and freedom from Karen. Until then, while we continued to live under her roof, it was impossible to make any serious plans for the future. The atmosphere in the house remained extremely tense and toxic. Karen would sometimes behave restrained, as if walking on thin ice, fearing losing us completely, but then she would erupt, showering me with disparaging remarks and biting barbs once again. I had to literally clench my fists to hold back and not lash out in response. Each of her words triggered a wave of irritation in me. I remained silent only because mentally I was already elsewhere, in our future home, where her venomous voice would no longer haunt me. At such moments, Susan would throw guilty looks at me, but I would shake my head negatively, indicating that she was not to blame. It all boiled down to her mother and her toxic behavior. Without her constant outbursts, we could still get along, but with each passing day, this became an increasingly elusive prospect. At times, it started to seem to me that Susan and I had no future at all as long as we were forced to live under the same roof as Karen. Making any serious life plans, discussing having children or major purchases was simply impossible in this atmosphere. Therefore, all our energy was focused on one goal, getting out of this stuffy cage as soon as possible. And finally, the long-awaited moment arrived. We had saved enough to rent our own, albeit tiny, room. On the day of our move, I felt like a bird whose cage door had been opened for the first time, allowing it to spread its wings in freedom. The conditions were quite cramped, but at least no one was looming over us, poisoning the atmosphere with caustic remarks and toxic behavior. During the first few months, Karen demonstratively avoided visiting or calling. It seemed she was still angry about our sudden departure. However, Susan regularly visited her. After all, she was her only daughter, and their bond remained intact. Gradually, Karen's resentment began to fade. After some time, she herself called Susan, and then cautiously visited us, bringing homemade treats as a peace offering. I greeted her cautiously, still wary of further insults, but Karen behaved meekly and even amiably. Apparently, the temporary separation from Susan and our final departure made her reconsider her behavior. Of course, our relationship didn't become completely idyllic, but now that we lived separately, Karen made an effort to keep herself in check and avoid her previous antics. Her visits to us became a kind of guest mode that she automatically switched to. As for Susan, my dear Susan, she blossomed, freed from the constant maternal pressure. Now she was happy, smiling, and reaching out to me, enjoying our independent life away from arguments and tiresome quarrels. Looking at her, I realized, now we have a real chance to find our own happiness and build a real family. There were many challenges ahead, but I was determined to overcome them together with my beloved woman, not allowing anyone else to threaten us with their toxic influence. This little room became the starting point for something bigger. The main task of my life.